We're kicking things off today with a pretty stark situation, really. A governor getting what sounded like a direct ultimatum from Washington. Use your state's national guard for federal tasks, or we'll take control of them ourselves.
Right. That's about as high stakes as it gets in terms of state versus federal power, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today, this attempt to federalize the Illinois National Guard. It really hits at the heart of questions about presidential authority, state sovereignty, and, using the military for domestic law enforcement.
Okay. So our sources for this deep dive, they're focused on the fallout, essentially. The Illinois situation, sure, but also the legal challenges popping up elsewhere, like California, and this wider pattern of federal forces being deployed in major cities across the U.S.
Yeah, and our goal here is to get a clear picture, quickly, of how this all works. What are the mechanics? Because it's not just, like, political drama, it's testing the Constitution, specifically the militia clauses. The big question really is, when does trying to restore order cross a line and become, well, as Governor Pritzker put it, un-American, and what legal ground are they standing on?
Let's start right there with the action itself. The Trump administration ordered the federalization of 300 Illinois National Guard members. What does that actually mean on the ground? For the soldiers, for the state?
It changes everything. This is really the key thing to grasp. Normally, the National Guard operates under Title 32 status. They're state troops, funded federally, yes, but the governor's in command. They're the state militia,
Right.
But federalization, that flips them to Title 10 status.
And Title 10 means?
It means command authority shifts completely, instantly. The governor is out of the loop control-wise. Those Guard members stop being the state militia and become active duty federal forces. They answer only to the president. So for Governor Pritzker, this wasn't just, a slap on the wrist politically. It was Washington trying to take away his authority over his own state's people.
And he reacted strongly, called it outrageous and un-American. The sources are pretty clear. The way it was presented was blunt, call up your troops, or we will. It sounds like real strong arming.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, his language, he called the administration, or maybe the Pentagon, the Department of War. It's a deliberate choice, right? Kind of an old-fashioned term. It frames this whole thing not as a modern political spat, but as this deep historical constitutional issue about using military force inside the country.
Good point. Now, Pritzker argued this was all a manufactured performance, political theater. He said, for Donald Trump, this has never been about safety. This is about control. But we do need to acknowledge the timing here. This threat didn't come out of nowhere. Tensions were already high in Chicago involving federal agents, weren't they?
Exactly. You can't really understand Pritzker's level of resistance without looking at what happened right before, particularly things involving the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Remember, federal agents had been involved in that really controversial shooting in Brighton Park just before this.
Right. That incident definitely poured fuel on the fire. A woman, crucially not the person they were looking for in an immigration operation, was shot, wounded.
And the justification from DHS, they said their agents opened fire because they were, quote, rammed by vehicles and boxed in by 10 cars. But here's a key detail. Chicago police were there, on the scene, but the reports emphasized they didn't fire. They weren't involved in the shooting. So for the governor, this was like a preview, wasn't it? Federal agents acting independently, sometimes violently, with little local oversight, and then came the move to take control of his state troops.
So his refusal, his promise to sue, it wasn't just abstract principles about states' rights. It was tied directly to worries about, well, unchecked federal power escalating on Chicago streets.
Which brings us right into the legal fights. These are really defining the whole conflict. And Illinois wasn't flying completely blind. They could look at what happened in California with Governor Newsom.
Right. Newsom actually managed to block a similar federal deployment in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
What was the legal argument there that worked? It seemed like a big win for the state side.
It was, definitely, at least initially. What's interesting is the court's reasoning. It wasn't just about politics. The federal court ruled that using state guard forces, once they're federalized under Title 10, for civilian law enforcement tasks, that was unlawful. There's a long history, limiting the military's role in domestic policing.
That sounds like the Posse Comitatus Act, right?
But that's the core idea, exactly. Now, Posse Comitatus has exceptions and it gets complicated, but the basic principle is strong. The federal military generally can't be used for day-to-day law enforcement unless Congress specifically says so. The court essentially questioned if using them for general order restoration fit those narrow exceptions. That ruling set a pretty significant precedent favoring state control, at least for that moment.
But here's the twist, right? The administration didn't just accept that. They appealed it immediately. So that case is now sitting with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the outcome there could really tip the scales one way or the other, couldn't it? Either confirming that executive power or reinforcing the governor's authority.
The stakes are incredibly high, yeah. And you had voices with military backgrounds weighing in, too. Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, an Army combat veteran herself, she had some very sharp words about the whole thing.
What was her main point? It seemed to come from a place of, functional concern for the military itself.
Very much so. She called it a dangerous, un-American, and unconstitutional abuse of our military. Her key argument was that soldiers, Guard members included, they signed up to defend the Constitution, not to be used as political props. She's drawing a very clear line, saying their job is national defense, border security maybe, but not acting as a federal police force inside the U.S.
And connecting this back, you mentioned sources, anonymous defense officials suggesting this wasn't just about Illinois or just for a short time.
Right. Reports indicated there were ongoing discussions about potentially longer-term federalized missions, not just Chicago, but maybe other major cities, too. That suggests this wasn't just a reaction to one situation, but maybe part of a broader strategy to assert this kind of federal authority more widely.
Okay, so let's zoom out then. Because the Illinois situation, it feels like one piece of a bigger puzzle, right?
Yeah.
A nationwide pattern, maybe, of federal power expanding into local policing. And they're using different tools for it.
That's the key synthesis, I think. We saw it happen elsewhere. Remember, units were federalized in Washington, D.C. over the summer, and then you have the whole situation playing out in Oregon.
Portland, yeah.
Yeah.
The administration announced plans to send federal troops there, too. The president described the city as war-ravaged, which local officials strongly pushed back on. They saw it as just an excuse for federal overreach and sued to block it.
And what's fascinating there is how it played out slightly differently. Around 200 Oregon National Guard troops were federalized, put under Title X, but, and this shows the state pushing back, they haven't actually gone into Portland. Reports say they're training out on the coast somewhere, basically in limbo. It's like this geographical standoff, highlighting the state leadership refusing to accept the federal narrative and control.
And it wasn't just the National Guard being federalized. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, seemed to be stepping up its role, too. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem announced sending extra special operations officers to Chicago.
Yeah, and we need to see the context for that, too. That announcement came right after those big protests outside an ICE facility in Broadview, remember, where about 13 people got arrested. So sending DHS special ops teams in response to protests, especially those related to immigration enforcement, it shows another way the administration was increasing federal presence locally, using federal civilian law enforcement, which has fewer constitutional restrictions than the military, perhaps to achieve a similar end goal.
So you're saying there's like a two-pronged strategy. Try the big, legally bold move with the National Guard, maybe change the rules that way,
Yeah.
while also just using existing federal agencies like DHS more aggressively on the ground.
That's how it looks, yeah. Testing the legal limits in court with the Guard federalization, while simultaneously testing the operational limits on the street with DHS agents. The core conflict boils down to this. A governor believes they have the right to manage law enforcement in their state. The president believes they have the authority, maybe even the duty, to federalize the Guard for domestic policing, even if the governor says no.
So for you, the listener, what this deep dive really shows is a constitutional pressure point heating up. These events in Illinois, California, Oregon, they're actively setting precedents, testing the legal boundaries for using military and federal law enforcement within states. It's a debate with deep historical roots, echoes of the civil rights era and federal troop deployments then.
And the outcomes of these legal challenges, especially that California appeal, they're going to shape how this works for years to come. You could argue the legal reasoning in the California case is actually more crucial long-term than the specific political fight in Illinois.
Which brings us to that final thought to leave you with. Let's say the appeals court, maybe eventually the Supreme Court does side with the federal government in that California case. If they effectively say, yes, the executive branch can broadly federalize state guard units for domestic policing, what does that do? How does that permanently shift the power balance? Does it weaken a governor's ability to control their own state's resources, their own personnel, if the federal government disagrees?
It could potentially make the whole idea of the state militia, as the Constitution outlines it, feel, well, significantly less independent when facing a determined federal executive. Almost toothless, perhaps.
That's definitely something to think about. Keep an eye on those court decisions and keep watching where that line between state power and federal intervention gets drawn. That's all for this deep dive.